An enormous intersection emerges at the heart of the city. The sky is covered by layers of heavy dark gray clouds, swirling as if heralding a violent storm about to swallow the entire metropolis. The cold light of a rainy afternoon reflects off the wet pavement, turning every white crosswalk stripe into a sharp line cutting through the endlessly moving sea of people. Hundreds of people silently cross the intersection beneath black and white umbrellas, creating a scene that feels both chaotic and lonely. The crowd resembles tiny chess pieces struggling to survive in a vast and indifferent world. Towering skyscrapers surround the crossing like cold concrete monoliths, while the faint yellow glow from a few roadside shops becomes one of the only sources of warmth amid the gloomy blue-gray palette of the rain. The modern city continues to function, yet the oppressive sky and frantic rhythm of urban life make everything feel tense, as though a major catastrophe is only seconds away. At the center of the vast intersection, a colossal column of water suddenly erupts from the heavens and crashes into the ground like a divine flood. It tears through the curtain of rain and engulfs the entire crossing in a cloud of white mist. The leaden gray sky blankets everything, while massive storm clouds churn above the cold high-rises. Diffused light filters through the water vapor, creating a suffocating intense atmosphere. Hundreds of pedestrians, beneath black and white umbrellas, hunch in panic under the overwhelming force of the water and wind, appearing like tiny figures desperately resisting the uncontrollable power of nature. Dense mist spreads across the streets, obscuring vehicles and surrounding blocks, transforming the modern city into something strange and chaotic within seconds. White road markings distort beneath the swirling water, while distant city lights flicker weakly like the final signals of a civilization slowly being submerged. It is as though an energy gateway has opened in the middle of Tokyo, and an invisible colossal entity has descended upon Earth, plunging the entire city into absolute fear and chaos. A small puddle on a rain-soaked street becomes the center of a heavy and ominous atmosphere. The dark, cold surface trembles with tiny ripples beneath the relentless rain, reflecting the distant city lights in warped shapes, like memories melting into darkness. A cold and lonely blur envelops the scene. Raindrops continuously strike the water, creating expanding rings that resemble the final heartbeat of a city slowly losing control. Blue-gray light blankets the wet pavement, giving the unsettling feeling that something enormous is drawing near. The unusual stillness of the water, combined with the mournful rhythm of the rain, makes it seem as though time itself, and the city, are holding their breath before an impending catastrophe. On the rain-soaked asphalt, hundreds of pitch-black creatures crawl out from the darkness, forming a strange symmetrical pattern like the mark of an ancient ritual. It is as though the ground beneath the city has awakened something that does not belong to the human world. Their small, sharp, densely packed bodies reflect the cold, blue-gray light from the overcast sky. Moving through pools of rainwater on the asphalt, they create expanding ripples like veins of life spreading beneath the city. Row after row stretches into the distance, resembling an endless army of darkness advancing in silence. The air is cold, dark, and suffocating, the first sign of an invasion by a mysterious force. The city in the distance is erased by darkness and rain, leaving only the uneasy feeling that modern civilization is facing something beyond its control. Inside a cold subway carriage, pale white lights reflect off the exhausted faces of office workers returning home at the end of the day. No one speaks. Each passenger is immersed in their own world, behind a phone screen in the familiar lifeless gaze of modern urban life. Yet, amid the silence, something unusual begins to emerge. A middle-aged man seated at the center of the frame wears a neatly tailored dark suit, his eyes fixed on the phone in his hand. A stream of dark red blood slowly runs from his nose to his lips. His face is pale, his expression vacant. The blood drips in the quiet carriage, creating an uncomfortable tension, like a silent warning of a disaster spreading unseen. The surrounding passengers continue looking down, isolated within the city's everyday indifference. No one notices the disturbing sign appearing right beside them. The suited man remains motionless, his eyes wide with shock as though he has suddenly realized something is terribly wrong. His face grows pale amid the emotional emptiness of the commuters around him. The atmosphere feels suffocating and profoundly lonely. A narrow alleyway appears, drenched in the cold gray tones of concrete and metal. Old walls stained with moisture, tangled air conditioning units, and power lines stretching overhead create a sense of confinement and oppression. Several crows stand silently upon the dark wires crossing the alley. The one in the center stares directly forward, its gaze eerie and foreboding. The silence is so complete that it feels possible to hear the cold wind slipping through cracks in the walls and the faint rustle of wings in the gloomy air. A black crow stands against the cold gray backdrop of the aging urban alley. Its dark feathers absorb almost all light, while its crimson eyes burn intensely. It remains motionless, staring straight ahead like a creature guarding some hidden secret within the sleeping city. The blurred background of worn walls and faded windows creates a feeling of abandonment. The atmosphere becomes heavier and darker. The crow exudes a sense of authority, like a symbol of an omen. The frame carries a quiet tension, as though within seconds this stillness will be shattered by an unpredictable event. 3 black crows stand silently on sagging power lines. The sky is covered in cold ash-gray clouds, and the pale afternoon light sinks everything into faded silver and gloom. Weathered concrete walls, old air conditioning units, and rusted metal pipes create a suffocating, lifeless environment. The crow in the center stares directly ahead, its glossy black eyes reflecting the faintest trace of light as though silently observing. The other 2 remain motionless like statues. The blurred background enhances the terrifying stillness, the sound of cold wind slipping through narrow alleyways and the distant vibration of metal somewhere within a dying city. Suddenly, all 5 crows standing motionless lose their grip and fall straight to the ground. The damp, dusty pavement is scattered with fallen black feathers. The 5 crows lie lifeless in the silent space, like omens of death descending upon the city. There is no blood, no sound, only an oppressive silence hanging over every meter of gray concrete. On either side of the alley stand aged walls coated with the dust of time, tangled with metal pipes and rusting air conditioning units. Faded posters cling crookedly to the surfaces. At the far end, a closed rolling door makes the scene feel even more claustrophobic and mysterious. It feels as though life itself has been drained away. The crows make the scene heavier and more haunting, turning it into the aftermath of a silent catastrophe. A thin veil of dust hovers near the ground. Even the last surviving creatures seem unable to escape the deadly atmosphere spreading through every dark corner of the alley. A paper coffee cup sits alone on an old wooden table, with the blurred city beyond. Dark drops of coffee leap into the air as if frozen in time. The liquid glistens in the soft golden light of late afternoon, making each droplet resemble a floating piece of amber moments before it shatters into the surface below. The background remains dreamlike and out of focus. A distant passerby is reduced to nothing more than a fleeting dark silhouette. The sound of coffee dripping is slow and steady. Gentle light washes across the scratched wooden surface. A bald man stands amid a crowded city street still wet from the rain, yet his gaze seems completely detached from the world around him. His face is tense, his lips slightly parted as though he has just realized something horrifying. He stares ahead in shock and confusion. While the crowd continues moving with indifferent routine, the man appears trapped in a moment where time itself has frozen. A simple brown coat covers his solitary figure, standing out against the cold blue-gray tones of the city. Modern Japanese streets blur behind him, the wet pavement reflects soft post-rain light. Amid the crowded city, he seems to be the only person who realizes the world is beginning to change in the most terrifying way imaginable. An overwhelming chill grips him. It's cold. Terrifyingly cold, the man says. Amid the bustling city, every sound and movement seems to vanish the moment he raises his head. His eyes widen in horror, his pupils reflecting something immense and incomprehensible appearing high above the sky. His mouth hangs open, his breath catches in his throat. Every wrinkle on his forehead and every tense vein along his neck amplify the emotion until it becomes almost unbearable. A colossal glass skyscraper stands alone in the middle of a silent city. Its entire facade reflects the heavy lead-gray sky, where swirling clouds suggest a storm consuming the world. Large windows near the upper floors are shattered into jagged fractures, making it seem as though the building itself has endured a horrific impact from an invisible force. The street below is dark and wet, reflecting the dim light of the stormy sky. Modern structures on both sides disappear into shadow. There are no people, no signs of life, only the terrifying silence of a forgotten city. Then, in a moment of apocalyptic chaos, the facade of the giant glass tower suddenly explodes outward from within, unleashing a storm of debris into the street like a tidal wave of glass. Thousands of razor-sharp shards spin through the air, reflecting the silver-gray light of the storm clouds. A massive cloud of dust rolls across the ground as though an immense pressure blast has pierced the building's core. Twisted steel frames are ripped from the structure. Giant fragments of glass spin like blades, while the dark void beyond the shattered facade suggests that something enormous is emerging from the darkness. Amid the cold concrete sea of a sprawling metropolis, Piccolo sits in meditation on a rooftop, as though the entire world below has vanished from his mind. Gray skyscrapers surround him, creating an atmosphere of oppression and lifelessness, yet at the center stands Piccolo, radiating an almost supernatural calm. A wide white cape drapes over his shoulders and back. Seated cross-legged and motionless in the wind, he appears to be silently containing unimaginable power. Pale daylight washes over the rough concrete. Only the sound of wind whistling between the buildings remains. That stillness creates a lingering tension, the calm immediately before a fateful battle erupts above the city. The green-skinned warrior resembles an ancient god seated atop the pinnacle of the modern world, despite doing nothing more than meditating in complete stillness. His white cape flutters gently in the wind. His stern face, half-closed eyes, and hands resting calmly before him reveal absolute concentration. The thick clouds gathering behind him signal that something enormous is approaching. Distant buildings fade into pale haze. Piccolo now rises to his feet, towering like a god of war, preparing to face Judgment Day itself. His mere presence seems enough to make the air over the city grow heavier. His dark purple outfit moves lightly in the wind. Both fists are clenched at his sides. His cold eyes gaze beyond the horizon. He has already sensed a threat approaching from somewhere beyond the swirling black clouds above. The sky is blanketed with heavy gray clouds. Pale natural light reflects from his green skin and the coarse fabric of his clothing. Everything is silent, stretched tight like a drawn bowstring, before immense power is unleashed. Piccolo has made his decision. He will enter the final battle to save a world standing on the brink of collapse. It's coming here, Piccolo says. In the heart of a vast city drowned beneath the gray hues of a storm, a towering red steel structure rose straight into the sky, like a colossal spear piercing through layers of dense black clouds. The scene carried a dark and oppressive atmosphere, as the entire city below lay beneath the pale, cold light of a rainy day that felt as though it came just before the end of the world. The clouds swirling overhead formed a gigantic vortex around the top of the tower, making this iconic structure appear to be the focal point of a supernatural event about to unfold. The rain-soaked streets below reflected dull, muted light, while the surrounding buildings disappeared into a veil of gray mist, making the city resemble a world slowly losing its life. Only the tower's metallic red color remained visible, lonely, proud, and fragile before nature's growing fury. There was no sunlight, no clear blue sky, only the sound of wind howling through the steel framework high above the city. The sky above the city looked as if it had been torn apart by a colossal supernatural storm. The towering broadcasting tower stood firmly amid the rain and the dark rows of buildings, like the last remaining pillar in a dying world. From the top of the tower, a beam of green energy shot directly toward the ground, erupting with intense brilliance and forming a massive vortex that covered the sky. Countless bolts of lightning flashed continuously within it, as though an apocalyptic gateway were opening. The eerie green light bathed the entire city in cold and gloomy tones. Thick black clouds churned violently, pressing down upon the horizon as if announcing an unstoppable catastrophe. The buildings below appeared tiny and helpless before the immense power descending from the heavens. The tower had become the convergence point of an extraterrestrial energy source. The light, colors, and overwhelming scale of the terrifying storm evoked the moment just before the complete collapse of the world. Amid a city shrouded in black clouds and cold rain, a gigantic green energy tornado suddenly emerged like a crack opening from hell itself. It spiraled straight from the sky to the ground, carrying countless green lightning bolts coursing along its body like living currents roaring in fury. Its glow cast an eerie green hue across the entire park and surrounding buildings. The air was thick with moisture and rain-filled mist. Massive columns of water were drawn upward around the center of the storm, creating the sensation that gravity itself was being distorted by an energy source not of Earth. The ground below blazed with light, forming a giant circle of energy. A heavy lead-gray sky hung over the city in an eerie silence. The appearance of this power felt capable of erasing an entire civilization within minutes. A colossal explosion had just torn apart the center of a park in the heart of the city. From the ground, a thick pillar of black smoke rose into the sky like a deadly mushroom cloud, twisting violently amid the invisible roar of destructive power. Earth, concrete, and debris were blasted in every direction, creating a wave of devastation that swept away everything in its path. The ground split open beneath the epicenter, as steam and white dust surged upward, mixing with dense black smoke and plunging the entire scene into chaos. Rows of nearby trees shook violently as though they were about to be uprooted, while distant buildings stood frozen beneath the cold gray sky, witnessing disaster unfold in the center of the modern city. The explosion resembled an attack from an alien source of energy. Chunks of earth hurled into the air conveyed a force far beyond human control. In only a few seconds, the city's peace had transformed into a hell of ash and despair. From the center of the enormous crater torn open in the earth, a muscular warrior slowly emerged amid the collapsing dust and falling debris around him. His body was covered in dirt and sand, his muscles taut as though forged from steel, while his black spiked hair gave him the appearance of a wild being possessing power beyond human limits. Behind him, streams of earth and rock cascaded down like floods, forming a colossal wall of chaos that filled the frame. The air trembled from the aftershocks of the impact, making the scene resemble a battlefield after a meteor strike. Small stones continuously bounced off the ground, as though the terrifying energy within his body was still being released. He pressed both hands against the fractured ground, lowering his head for a few seconds before rising to his feet, a brief moment of silence filled with menace, as if heralding an imminent eruption of rage. Within the enormous chasm crushed by unimaginable power, Broly stood like a god of war emerging from the depths of hell. His body was covered in mud and scorched cracks, every bulging muscle beneath his skin appearing to contain enough energy to tear the earth apart. His fists were clenched tightly at his sides, heavy breaths escaping into the dust-filled air rising from the abyss behind him. His wild, upward spiking hair moved in the wind, giving him the appearance of a creature beyond humanity's limits. The metal collar around his neck was a reminder that he had once been a monster kept in chains for years, and had only now been set free. His gaze was fixed upon the heavy gray sky, cold and murderous, as though waiting for a battle capable of destroying the entire world. A terrifying silence lingered before the coming storm of rage. He looked like a living weapon born solely for combat and destruction. Broly's eyes burned with fierce determination despite exhaustion. His spiked hair whipped through the wind, tinted by the cold blue-gray light. Dirt, dried blood, and deep cuts covered his face and body, bearing the marks of countless battles. Every wrinkle, every bead of sweat, and every icy gleam in his eyes appeared vividly real. His shoulders and bare chest were packed with powerful muscle. A man stood silently on the edge of the shattered ravine, like the final witness to a catastrophe that had consumed the world. The ground beneath him had been torn apart into broken slabs of concrete, exposing dry, cracked soil like an open wound still aching with pain. Fallen trees leaned on either side after a devastating explosion. Nothing remained but the pale white sky and a dreadful silence hanging over everything. The man wore a simple brown jacket and blue jeans. Standing motionless with his arms at his sides, he looked into the abyss as though witnessing irreversible consequences. Hope itself seemed to have been crushed along with the earth. You, who are you? Krillin asked. Krillin's face appeared frozen in the most horrifying moment of his life. His eyes were wide with terror and despair, reflecting something unspeakably dreadful. Deep lines creased his forehead, while his lips parted as though he wanted to shout a warning, yet fear had sealed his throat. Behind him, the sky churned with layers of rolling gray clouds. Cold silver light illuminated his face, the rough skin, bloodshot eyes, and rapid breathing of a man standing at the boundary between hope and collapse. In only a few more seconds, everything would change forever. Krillin's fear was more visible on his face than any dialogue could ever describe. Beneath a sky covered in swirling storm clouds, Android 18 stood on the edge of the ravine. Her arms were folded across her chest, her expression calm and unreadable. Her blonde hair drifted lightly in the wind beneath the dull gray sky. "Don't get any closer, Krillin. He's not an ordinary person," Android 18 said. At the center of the massive crater, Broly, the gigantic muscular warrior, burst from the ground in the aftermath of his primal rage. His arms were tightly clenched, his entire posture tense as though compressing a terrifying power ready to erupt at any moment. His wild hair stood upright in the wind. The ground beneath him exploded into towering columns of earth and dust. Massive rocks were hurled from the earth by the pressure of an invisible force, making it seem as though the planet's crust itself was being crushed from within. Dust and debris swirled around his body like an energy storm taking shape. Broly leapt out of the crater. His landing carried the weight of a natural disaster, as though an unstoppable entity had descended upon the earth with unimaginable force. The asphalt along the crater's edge shattered into massive chunks. Concrete slabs were torn from the ground and thrown wildly through the dense clouds of dust surging from the crater. Long jagged cracks spread across the road into the distance. His mud-covered boots stood firmly upon the ruined edge of the abyss, radiating overwhelming dominance. Everything around him appeared small and fragile. His mere presence was enough to make the entire world tremble. Behind him, rows of trees faded into gray dust and cold light. Only the sounds of falling debris, cracking earth, and expanding pressure remained. Broly's wild spiked hair spread outward like blades beneath the cold silver-gray light of the sky. His face was covered in dirt, dried blood, and deep scars. His eyes showed no emotion, yet carried such immense pressure that they seemed capable of crushing anything with a glance. The dirt and wounds covering his skin only made his enormous physique appear even more fearsome. Behind him, layers of black clouds moved heavily, like an apocalyptic storm gathering strength. Gloomy light engulfed the scene, making every detail of his face and muscles appear as cold and hard as carved stone. Broly turned his head, looking left and right. On a cold rooftop, Piccolo crouched low in a guarded stance, like a protector surveying the entire city from hundreds of meters above. His white cape fluttered lightly in the cold wind. Piccolo's face was tense, his focused eyes sharp and alert, as though sensing a colossal threat approaching. Though powerfully built, he maintained the composure of a battle-hardened warrior accustomed to war, loss, and conflicts beyond human limits. The skyscrapers behind him stretched endlessly through mist and cold light, making the city appear both modern and desolate. The world was almost completely silent, filled only with the weight of strong winds, drifting dust, and tension before an imminent confrontation. Piccolo raised both hands and removed his turban and cape. The white cape billowed violently as he pulled it from his shoulders, the guardian discarding his final layer of restraint and revealing his readiness to fight with his full power. "That isn't ordinary light," Piccolo said. His green face tightened with fury, teeth clenched and eyes widened with piercing intensity. Veins stood out across his neck and muscles. His dark purple G fluttered in the powerful wind atop the rooftop. His pointed ears and small antennae were clearly visible. The air itself seemed to thicken beneath the invisible pressure before battle, a moment when anger ceased to be an emotion and became a weapon. Then it erupted. Broly unleashed the entirety of the rage imprisoned within him. His roar thundered like an explosion tearing apart the storm-filled sky behind him. Every muscle in his face tightened, veins and scars becoming visible beneath the eerie green light as the power within him surged beyond all control. His upward spiking hair whipped violently as though caught in an invisible storm. A blazing green aura erupted from every part of his body, surrounding him like living plasma fire consuming the air itself. Massive streams of energy spiraled around him, making it seem as though both earth and sky trembled under the pressure radiating from the warrior. The metal collar around his neck reflected the brilliant green glow. Dirt, dried blood, and old wounds covered his skin. His eyes were wide with madness, yet remained terrifyingly sharp, as though the last remnants of his humanity were being swallowed by primordial fury. Behind him, gray clouds twisted violently beneath the green radiance pouring from his body, making the entire sky appear warped by the monstrous energy. The air felt compressed to the point of suffocation. Only seconds remained before the entire world exploded alongside Broly's rage. Broly threw back his head and screamed amid the raging energy storm, the sound echoing like the detonation of a collapsing star. The green aura surrounding him burned so intensely that it seemed capable of incinerating everything. Massive bolts of energy lightning tore through space on both sides, twisting like glowing electric dragons writhing around the warrior's body. The air distorted under the overwhelming pressure, creating the sensation that reality itself was being bent by the power he had unleashed. His face was consumed by primal fury, his mouth opened wide in a savage roar while the muscles and veins in his neck strained to their limits. His hair streamed backward through the storm of light as a living explosion of energy spread outward in all directions. The heart of a modern metropolis lay beneath a sky heavy with an approaching storm. A vast boulevard stretched in a perfectly straight line between towering skyscrapers, like a concrete tunnel leading directly toward the catastrophe erupting on the horizon. Rain-soaked pavement reflected the cold, silver-gray light of the sky, creating an eerie silence before the moment of annihilation. A colossal explosion erupted violently in the center of the city. A blazing white fireball expanded like an artificial sun born upon the earth, consuming everything around it in blinding light. A gigantic column of smoke and debris spiraled upward, piercing the dense black storm clouds above, making the entire sky seem to tremble beneath the unimaginable force of the blast. On both sides of the boulevard, high-rise buildings covered in signs and glass facades reflected the distant explosion. The feeling of the apocalypse seemed to spread through every street and corner. Scattered vehicles rested along the nearly deserted road, making the scene feel even more lonely and terrifying. The white light from the explosion sliced through the rain and the murky gray atmosphere, the moment when the entire city seemed to realize there was no escape from the nightmare rushing toward it. A city once filled with life now stood on the brink of being erased by a single explosion powerful enough to shake the heavens. The disaster unfolded with overwhelming destructive force, as if the city's core had been torn apart from within by an invisible hand. At its center, a massive explosion blazed with violent intensity, unleashing a shockwave that crushed everything in its path. Cars were hurled off the streets like weightless toys, spinning helplessly through storms of dust and debris. Thousands of fragments of concrete, shattered glass, twisted metal, and torn billboards were ripped from surrounding structures, forming a gigantic cloud of destruction spreading in every direction. Steel sign frames bent and ripped free into the air, while the pavement below was pulverized into a sea of rubble. Dense clouds of dust and white smoke surged upward, swallowing the space between rows of skyscrapers. Orange-white light from the heart of the explosion pierced through the thick haze. Along the boulevard, modern towers stood like helpless witnesses to the force tearing the city apart. Their windows reflected flames and flying debris, giving the impression that the entire urban landscape was trembling with every passing second. In the middle of a street that had once been alive with activity, now reduced to a graveyard of concrete and steel, Android 18 stood at the center of the devastation. Buildings lining the boulevard had been ripped apart. Their facades had collapsed into mountains of rubble, while dust and smoke lingered in the air like a battlefield fog that had yet to settle. Above, the sky was covered by heavy black clouds, casting the entire landscape in cold gray tones. Amid the destruction, Android 18 stood firm. Her feet were planted on the shattered ground amid broken masonry and the remains of the city. One arm extended straight forward. Within her open palm, a brilliant blue-white energy source erupted with overwhelming intensity. Its light reflected across her tense face, illuminating every detail of her anger and unwavering determination. She burned like a star amid the ashes. Broken timber, shattered benches, and endless piles of debris surrounded her, the final moment before the true storm arrived, when a lone warrior gathered every ounce of strength for one last counterattack. Android 18 stood firmly at the center of the frame, her legs anchored deep into the dust-covered ground. Her face was locked in a fierce scream, eyes blazing with determination amid the chaos. From her outstretched hand, a colossal blue-white energy beam erupted, so bright that it tore through the dust-filled air and bathed the entire street in radiant cold light. Electric arcs and particles of energy exploded outward like a meteor shower, forming a massive torrent of power, racing forward at terrifying speed. The pressure of the blast sent spirals of dust swirling around her body while fragments of rubble trembled beneath the force of the unleashed energy. On both sides of the street stood collapsed buildings, shattered windows, and walls reduced to skeletal frames. Amid the devastation, the blue-white beam became the only point of focus, like a divine lightning bolt piercing the darkness of the apocalypse. She poured every ounce of strength into a final attack, the moment when the fate of the entire city seemed destined to be decided by a single surge of energy. The gigantic blue-white beam surged forward at horrifying speed, carrying twisting streams of electricity like living lightning. Its blinding brilliance tore through the dust, transforming the entire street into a radiant corridor of light. But at the center of that energy storm, Broly continued advancing. He walked directly through the beam. Every muscle tightened beneath the overwhelming force crashing into his chest. Electrical discharges exploded across his skin, scattering thousands of sparks like deadly fireworks, yet his pace never slowed. Each step sent dust swirling beneath his feet. His cold, unyielding gaze pierced through the blinding light ahead. The colossal warrior charged forward like a living storm. His muscular back surged with power as every heavy step crushed rubble beneath him and sent waves of dust rolling behind him. There was not the slightest sign of hesitation. Ahead, Android 18 poured everything into the enormous blue-white beam. The torrent of energy blasted through space with devastating intensity, striking Broly directly, yet he remained completely unharmed. The attack's light reflected across cracked walls. Dust clouds were blown backward by the pressure of the beam, while glowing particles floated through the air like the ashes of a dying world. Broly surged forward with the speed of a hurricane. His massive body twisted with the momentum of a devastating punch. Every muscle in his arm and shoulder bulged beneath the explosive force. Dust and shattered stone erupted behind him, forming a violent trail through the battlefield. The instant his fist connected, a gigantic orange-gold explosion erupted. Thousands of sparks and fragments of energy blasted outward in every direction like a storm of fire. The collision illuminated the entire scene, reflecting across shattered walls and swirling clouds of smoke. At the center of the explosion, Android 18's silhouette was nearly swallowed by the blinding radiance. The air itself seemed compressed and detonated in the same instant, as the force of the strike tore at the very fabric of space. Dust and smoke flooded the battlefield, mixing with golden sparks and drifting debris. After the attack, the camera swept low across the ground, gliding over massive chunks of concrete and endless fields of rubble left behind by a city crushed by war. Along the boulevard, ruined buildings stood as hollow concrete skeletons of a fallen civilization. Layers of cold gray clouds covered the sky. Amid the sea of debris and collapsed structures, Android 18 lay motionless on the ground. Her face rested to one side, covered in dust and exhaustion, as though she had been dragged through a battle far beyond human limits. Thin clouds of dust still lingered in the air after the tremendous shockwaves. The brilliant energy blasts and blinding explosions were gone. Only a heavy silence remained. The wind whistled through shattered windows, echoing among the ruins. Cold gray light from the overcast sky washed over the destruction, giving everything a bleak post-apocalyptic atmosphere. After the violent clashes, only a survivor remained lying among the remnants of devastation. Scratches, dirt, and battle scars covered her face and clothing. Her faded denim jacket and striped shirt were torn in many places and coated in ash. Strands of blonde hair lay scattered across a slab of cold concrete. Her eyes were closed. The delicate features that once carried confidence now showed only exhaustion and vulnerability, standing in stark contrast to the brutality of the world around her. A mournful silver-gray light covered the entire scene. "Ha ha ha, who's next?" Broly asked. He stood like a living mountain amid the ruined city. Broly planted his feet wide apart on the devastated boulevard. Massive muscles rippled beneath skin marked by scars and dust. His green hair rose upward like sharp blades, trembling slightly in the cold wind, carrying the ashes of war. Both fists were clenched tightly at his sides. Veins bulged across his arms and chest as though an unimaginable power were struggling to remain contained within his body. His glowing eyes shone from a face that was both savage and terrifying. A crooked, threatening smile spread across his lips, the smile of a warrior who knew no one remained strong enough to stop him. Around him, the city had become nothing more than a cemetery of concrete and steel. Skyscrapers had been torn apart, their exposed structural frames resembling the skeletons of dead giants. Black smoke rose from distant ruins, and merged with the heavy lead-colored sky. Cold stormlight illuminated his towering figure, emphasizing every muscle, every scar, and every mark left by the battle. The air was thick with dust and a dreadful silence before the next eruption of violence. The final monster still stood proudly amid the ashes of an entire city. Krillin focused with absolute concentration. His face was tense with unshakable determination. Before his chest burned a brilliant sphere of golden energy like a miniature sun. Rings of light spiraled around his body at incredible speed, creating luminous trails through the air. Golden sparks burst outward in every direction, reflecting off shattered concrete and twisted steel scattered across the street. The intense glow pierced through the dust, creating brilliant orange-gold halos against the cold gray palette of the ruined world. Behind him, collapsed buildings and distant towers faded into the haze, while the golden energy grew brighter and brighter, overwhelming everything around it. The moment before the decisive counterattack, Krillin launched forward like a bullet of light, racing through the devastated corridor of a city torn apart by war. On both sides of the road, skyscrapers had become broken concrete skeletons standing beneath storm-laden skies. A brilliant golden energy surge exploded at the center of his charge. Long streams of radiant light stretched behind him in parallel trails, tearing through the atmosphere, and spreading across the roadway like rivers of molten gold racing forward at supernatural speed. The ground, rubble, and surrounding walls blurred into streaks, as though space itself were being bent by the overwhelming force. Golden light reflected through clouds of dust and shattered concrete, bathing the post-apocalyptic world in a fierce and threatening glow. Broly lowered his center of gravity. His feet dug deep into the fractured ground while every muscle in his arms bulged violently. Then, his power exploded. One fist shot forward to meet the incoming golden energy spear. The blazing attack pierced through smoke and dust as it raced through the city at terrifying speed. The collision illuminated the battlefield, transforming the surrounding ruins into distorted black silhouettes within an ocean of golden fire. Shockwaves swept across the ground, hurling stone, concrete, and metal into the air. Thousands of sparks erupted like a meteor shower while enormous dust clouds rose behind the warrior. Broly had deflected the energy blast. His muscles surged like molten steel beneath his skin. Green hair stood upright in the storm. Both fists remained clenched at his sides, ready to crush anything foolish enough to challenge him. The deflected beam slammed into the facade of a ruined building, triggering a massive explosion. A blazing orange fireball burst through gray smoke, launching concrete and metal fragments high into the air. Tiny sparks scattered like deadly fireworks. The ground trembled beneath the dense clouds of dust swirling around his feet. Chunks of rubble floated within the shockwave, while the air itself seemed saturated with the power that had just been unleashed. Yet amid all the chaos, Broly never moved an inch. The cold smile on his face suggested that the explosion behind him was merely a minor consequence of the terrifying power that existed within him. An invincible warrior stands amid a collapsing city, while fire, smoke, and ruins form the backdrop to a moment of absolute power before the final battle erupts once again. A close-up of Broly's face captures the suffocating tension of the instant before his fury is unleashed. His green hair rises upward like razor-sharp blades framing a battle-worn face. Long scars cut across his forehead, cheekbones, and chin. Dirt, dried blood, and sweat cover his tanned skin, giving him a brutal, rugged appearance. His eyes narrow into cold slits of light, holding a terrifying, primal rage. Veins bulge around his temples, and the muscles in his face tighten violently. His teeth are clenched so hard they turn white, as though he is struggling to contain a colossal power desperate to shatter every limit within his body. He resembles a creature once restrained by chains, but now beyond all control. His gaze radiates murderous intent, a legendary warrior preparing to unleash enough power to shake the entire battlefield and alter the fate of everything around him. "I'm sick of you, Baldy," Broly says. His massive bare back is covered in bulging muscles, marked by countless scars and the remnants of brutal battles. He exudes a wild, uncontrollable, and deeply threatening presence. Standing opposite him in the middle of a road littered with broken bricks and rubble is Krillin. He steps backward, eyes wide with terror, his hands raised instinctively in defense. Amid the vast devastation, his small figure appears desperately fragile, like an ordinary man standing before the embodiment of power beyond all limits. The scene conveys absolute domination. The fear on Krillin's face creates suffocating tension, like the final moment before an unstoppable catastrophe is unleashed. Cold gray tones blanket everything, and every passing second signals the coming explosion of a confrontation on a city-destroying scale. Just in front of Broly's outstretched hand, a gigantic white-green energy sphere erupts violently like a newborn sun emerging from the earth itself. Its intense radiance consumes every surrounding detail, turning ruined buildings and debris into faint silhouettes within a sea of blinding light. Green bolts of electricity coil around the blast like living lightning serpents, continuously releasing chaotic streams of energy through the thick clouds of dust. Shockwaves spread across the street, hurling rubble and debris into the air. The atmosphere appears warped by the immense power being released, creating the impression that the very fabric of space is trembling under the pressure of an uncontrollable energy source. The entire avenue becomes the epicenter of an explosion capable of changing the fate of the city in a single heartbeat. The energy blast shoots directly toward Krillin. A devastating shockwave sweeps across the street. The ground trembles violently, launching dust, dirt, and broken masonry into a massive storm. Multi-ton concrete slabs are lifted from the pavement and spun through the air as if gravity itself has ceased to exist. Twisted steel beams and fragments of architecture streak through the dust-filled haze, creating a sense of total chaos and loss of control. Dense clouds of smoke spiral upward into towering gray-black columns, obscuring most of the distant landscape. Countless particles of dust fill the air, turning the cold light of the sky dull and suffocating. The entire city seems to be crushed beneath a force beyond imagination. Enormous chunks of concrete fly through the air, the immediate aftermath of a colossal power being unleashed. A moment when the city itself becomes nothing more than disintegrating ruins swallowed by the roar of dust and destruction. After the energy collision. At the heart of a city crushed to its foundations by war, a once bustling avenue has become an endless sea of shattered concrete, broken stone, and twisted steel protruding from the ground like the skeleton of a dead world. In the foreground, Krillin lies motionless among the rubble. His brown jacket and jeans are covered in dust and torn by violent impacts. Wounds and gray dirt mark his face, while his eyes remain closed in complete exhaustion. One arm hangs limply across the broken stones, emphasizing his fragility and isolation within the immense devastation around him. Behind him, the city resembles a graveyard of civilization. Skyscrapers have been ripped apart, facades collapsed, and dark, empty windows stretch toward the horizon. Thin columns of smoke continue to rise from the ruins like the final breaths of a place once full of life. In the center of the background, the silhouette of a towering structure rises through the dust and lead-gray sky. Its sharp form appears like a silent monument, witnessing the catastrophe that has just unfolded. Heavy black clouds swirl overhead, immersing the entire scene in an atmosphere of apocalypse and despair. It is the haunting silence, after a terrifying energy storm, when the explosions have faded, the dust begins to settle, and all that remains is the crushing stillness of a city brought to its knees by unimaginable power. On top of a ruined skyscraper, overlooking a city pulverized by supernatural force, roads have become oceans of rubble, collapsed concrete forms, mountain-like piles, and black smoke rises through thick curtains of dust. At the center below stands Broly, the giant green-haired warrior, motionless amid the destruction like a living mountain. His massive body is covered with wounds and scars, every muscle bulging beneath battle-worn skin, radiating the presence of a primal force capable of tearing apart the city with his bare hands. He raises his head, his cold gaze locked onto the target above. On the edge of the high rooftop stands Piccolo in his purple guy, lowering his center of gravity and preparing to descend like a predator about to deliver the killing blow. Cracked concrete fragments scatter beneath his feet, while the space between the two opponents feels stretched by the invisible pressure of the impending battle. A heavy lead-gray sky hangs overhead, swirling with dark clouds as though nature itself is holding its breath to witness the confrontation, a moment before two powers capable of destroying the entire city collide in a fateful clash. Piccolo launches from the edge of the ruined building, his body suspended in midair like an arrow just released from a bow. His arms spread wide, muscles tense, his posture embodying the absolute determination of a warrior ready to enter a fight to the death. A hero descends from the sky. A destroyer stands among the ruins. The city becomes an arena for a confrontation that may determine the fate of everything that remains. Within seconds, this oppressive silence will be shattered by an impact powerful enough to shake the wasteland itself. The moment Piccolo lands, the ground erupts in a violent seismic explosion. Hundreds of chunks of concrete and stone are blasted into the air, swirling through dense gray dust as if a meteor has struck the street. Broly stands at the center of the storm of destruction. His enormous body resembles a living fortress, muscles standing out beneath scarred skin, fists clenched tightly, motionless yet radiating overwhelming power capable of crushing everything before him. His gaze lowers coldly toward the opponent who has just entered the battlefield. Facing him is Piccolo, having landed with tremendous force. One knee bends slightly within the exploding cloud of dust, showing that he is absorbing the impact before immediately stepping into battle. It feels like the final moment of calm before the true storm arrives. Fragments of stone and concrete hang suspended in the air, as though held in place by the invisible energy emanating from both warriors. It is a moment of absolute tension, where two beings possessing power beyond natural limits stand face to face, only heartbeats away from a catastrophic battle. Amid a road covered in ash and debris, the two warriors face one another in suffocating silence. There are no blinding explosions or raging energy blasts now, only a threatening stillness before the storm truly begins. Broly appears as a living war machine. Every muscle rises as though carved from granite. His fists remain clenched at his sides, shoulders as broad as fortress walls. Though standing still amid the ruins, he creates the impression that the earth itself is trembling beneath the weight of the immense power restrained within him. Piccolo stands in his battle-worn purple gi. He remains steady amid the haze of dust, his eyes unwavering despite facing an opponent capable of crushing the entire city. His posture is calm but resolute against the primal power surging before him. Broly assumes an attacking stance and throws a punch with enough speed to tear through the air. Every muscle swells beneath scarred skin marked by countless battles. His upright green hair stands out against the bleak surroundings, while a primal energy remains compressed inside his gigantic frame. His cold eyes lock onto the target ahead. Piccolo stands firmly, both feet planted on the debris-covered street. His calm but vigilant expression shows that he fully understands the terrifying power before him. He quickly raises his arm to intercept Broly's incoming strike. Broly twists his body and unleashes a devastating hook. The movement is so fast that his hair and upper body blur into streaks of kinetic force, creating the impression that the air itself is being ripped apart by raw power. His muscles tighten like solid stone, every motion carrying destructive force. Across from him, Piccolo maintains his guard amid the storm of attacks. His body turns slightly to the side, fists clenched, eyes completely focused on the incoming blow. There is no panic, only the cold determination of a warrior who has survived countless life and death battles. Broly charges forward like a raging tempest, his arm extending in a crushing punch aimed directly at his opponent. The massive muscles across his body tighten to their limits beneath the cold light of the stormy sky. His green hair streams backward with the momentum of the attack, emphasizing speed and nearly uncontrollable power. Leaning forward, his eyes remain fixed on the target with the determination of a warrior focused solely on victory. Opposite him, Piccolo barely manages to react. His arm rises instinctively, attempting to absorb the force crashing toward him like a gigantic hammer. His defensive posture reveals the overwhelming pressure of the strike, every muscle in his body straining against the impact. Broly completes a devastating horizontal swing. The muscles in his shoulders, arms, and back bulge so prominently that they seem ready to tear through his skin. The speed of the motion turns his arm into a powerful blur, making it appear as though the air itself is being crushed by the force of the attack. The punch lands cleanly, slamming directly into Piccolo's face. The impact tears him from his trajectory. His body twists violently to one side, head and shoulders snapping in the direction of the strike. Every fold of his clothing ripples violently, reflecting the immense force transmitted through his body. The physical impact emphasizes the terrifying gap in power between the two warriors. After the attack, Piccolo lies motionless amid the enormous ruins. His powerful body is covered with dirt and wounds from the brutal battle. His purple gi is torn to shreds, frayed and damaged in countless places. His head rests against broken slabs of concrete, eyes half closed in exhaustion, as though every last drop of strength has been drained by the devastating confrontation. Around him, bent steel beams protrude from shattered concrete like the exposed skeletons of a fallen civilization. There are no voices, no signs of life, only the cold silence that follows a storm of destruction. Ash-gray tones dominate the landscape, creating a bleak and tragic ending, where the entire city seems to hold its breath while awaiting the unresolved fate of the last warrior left standing. Above, the gloomy sky churns with layers of heavy black clouds, casting an apocalyptic gray light over the battlefield. Just when it seems that everything has been buried beneath the ruins, the ground suddenly trembles violently. A colossal pillar of dust erupts from the center of the impact zone, launching hundreds of rocks and concrete fragments into the sky as though gravity itself has lost control. At the center of that seismic upheaval, Future Trunks appeared in a powerful landing stance. He knelt low within the newly formed crater, both hands firmly resting on his knees, his body taut like a sword freshly drawn from its sheath. His cold, piercing gaze was fixed straight ahead, unwavering despite the chaos erupting around him. Behind him, the sword slung across his back emerged faintly through the swirling dust. His dark blue jacket fluttered gently in the lingering shockwave. Massive boulders hung suspended in midair. Fragments of debris streaked past the camera, while an enormous wall of dust in the background continued to swell outward like a tsunami of earth and stone, consuming everything in its path. Countless tiny particles reflected the cold light of the storm-filled sky, giving the entire scene a feeling that was both majestic and suffocating. Time itself seemed to slow amid the roar of collapsing earth and raging dust storms. The young warrior stood as the final beacon of hope, calm and unyielding in the midst of destruction's fury. Trunks stood tall with unwavering determination. His feet were planted deep into the fractured ground, as if his very body had become the last remaining anchor in a world falling apart. An indomitable spirit radiated from every movement. His fists hung low at his sides, muscles tense and ready for the next confrontation awaiting him ahead. Amid the ruins of a city crushed by war, future Trunks stood firmly upon the shattered roadway like the last fortress in a sea of devastation. Towering heaps of collapsed concrete stretched behind him like ruined hills, where buildings had been reduced to charred skeletons and dark windows resembling the hollow eye sockets of dead giants. Above, the sky was smothered by layers of dense storm clouds, swirling in cold shades of leaden gray. Weak rays of light pierced through the cloud cover, creating a heavy, tense atmosphere, as though nature itself were witnessing the moment that would determine the world's fate. At the center of it all, future Trunks gripped his massive sword with both hands. The cold steel blade reflected the faint light of the gloomy sky across a landscape buried in dust and ash. His lowered stance, wide footing, and rigid posture made it clear that he was ready to charge into battle without the slightest intention of retreating. His pale purple hair fluttered softly in the wind, his face was cold and completely focused, his eyes as sharp as blades locked directly onto his opponent. There was no hesitation left, no trace of fear, only a fighting spirit forged through countless losses and sacrifices. Around him, twisted steel beams protruded from the rubble like gigantic claws tearing through the earth. Fine dust still lingered in the air. The unusual silence carried an almost unbearable tension. Trunks moved at incredible speed. The battlefield's brief silence was shattered in an instant by a colossal explosion erupting in the middle of the ruined avenue. A blinding white-gold fireball consumed the center of the frame, shining so intensely that it washed out every surrounding detail, as though a second sun had been born within the dying city. Shockwaves erupted from the heart of the blast, hurling dust and shattered concrete into the sky. On both sides of the road, enormous piles of rubble and the remains of collapsed buildings were bathed in the brilliant golden glow of the flames. The burning structures in the background resembled colossal skeletons. Torn concrete floors, twisted steel supports, and shattered walls reflected the explosion's light. The overwhelming radiance from the blazing sphere flooded the battlefield. Trunks was nowhere to be seen, only pure energy remained, erupting with unimaginable destructive power. The flames spiraled upward in layer upon layer, continuously expanding and rising, as though the very air itself were being incinerated by a force beyond human limits. In the foreground stood Broly. His enormous back, covered in wounds, dust, and battle scars, resembled a living wall of steel. Massive muscles rippled beneath his rugged skin, embodying a primal strength capable of crushing anything in its path. His stance appeared calm, yet deeply threatening, like a monster waiting for its prey to step into its range of destruction. Facing him, future Trunks launched himself into the air above the sea of ruins. His body hovered in a perfect attack posture, both hands tightly gripping his silver blade, which reflected the cold light of the storm-dark sky. His blue jacket whipped in the wind, and his eyes remained locked on the target ahead with absolute focus. Every muscle in his body was drawn tight like a bowstring preparing to unleash its decisive strike. Dust and smoke rose from the ground, weaving through ruined structures and bent steel beams. The sky above was covered by layers of heavy black clouds, casting a cold and merciless light over the battlefield. On one side, stood the overwhelming brute force of a seemingly invincible giant warrior. On the other stood speed, determination, and a razor-sharp blade. Time itself seemed frozen just before the collision. Trunks remained suspended in midair, one leg bent to maintain balance, while the other extended behind him in a flawless attack stance. Both hands gripped the sword's hilt tightly, as he raised the gleaming blade high above his head, preparing to unleash a decisive slash. Every ounce of his strength, speed, and fighting spirit seemed concentrated into that fleeting moment before the blade descended. Broly lunged forward violently, unleashing an attack with tremendous force. The devastating strike tore through the air at blistering speed. The massive muscles across his back tightened, while his upright green hair trembled amid the storm of dust and debris. Before him, the ground seemed to explode. Concrete slabs, rocks, and twisted metal were ripped from the street and hurled skyward in every direction. A gigantic wall of dust surged forward like a tsunami, swallowing the entire space between the two warriors. Debris flew at incredible speed, creating the sensation that even the air itself was being crushed by the energy of their confrontation. A brilliant golden light erupted from the background, piercing through the thick dust cloud like the flames of a fresh explosion. The vivid gold contrasted sharply against the ashen gray tones of the ruined city. Burned-out buildings lining the avenue appeared faintly through the dust, like ghosts of a collapsing civilization. The moment of impact arrived. All the energy that had been compressed until now was suddenly unleashed in a colossal explosion of kinetic force. Earth, dust, smoke, and light merged into a vortex of destruction, turning the battlefield into the epicenter of a conflict far beyond human limits. The blow had been delivered. The powers had collided. The entire city seemed to tremble beneath the aftershock of their clash. Broly's strike had landed. Future Trunks was knocked completely off his attack trajectory, his body flung into the air like a puppet with its strings severed. In the foreground, Broly remained standing amid the sea of ruins. His enormous back, covered with bulging muscles, dominated nearly the entire left side of the frame, an overwhelming force that seemed impossible to move. The counterattack had happened so quickly that it was almost invisible, leaving only its consequences visible in the sky ahead. Trunks was hurled high into the leaden-gray sky. His body spun out of control, arms spread wide, and legs thrown off balance as if struck by a catastrophic force. His sword remained in his hand, but it no longer carried the appearance of an offensive strike. Now it was merely a blurred streak of steel lost within the chaos of motion. Broly radiated overwhelming power and menace, embodying the primal fury of a warrior who had surpassed the boundaries of reason. His face appeared carved from stone and war itself, covered with scars, cracks, and the marks of countless bloody battles. Veins bulged beneath his taut skin, reflecting a rage that had reached its absolute limit. The most terrifying feature was his eyes. His crimson pupils burned like overloaded reactor cores, emitting a deep red glow that pierced the cold air around him. There was no trace of human emotion left in that gaze. It resembled the stare of an ancient force of destruction awakened after centuries of imprisonment. A red aura spread around his eye sockets, making his entire face appear illuminated from within by a source of uncontrollable power. His teeth clenched so tightly that the muscles along his jaw bulged with tension. Each exposed tooth seemed part of a silent roar, as though he were suppressing a fury capable of tearing apart everything before him. Sweat and dirt mixed together across his face, running along old wounds. His upright green hair spread outward like frozen flames amid the storm. Each sharp strand formed a violent halo around his face, emphasizing his savage nature and power beyond ordinary limits. The ruined city faded into little more than vague silhouettes. All attention was drawn toward the blazing red eyes at the center of the frame. Only the face of incarnate rage remained. "Hey, you big brute!" Vegeta's voice echoed across the battlefield. Atop a ruined skyscraper, within the dying city, Vegeta stood beneath the storm-filled sky, like the embodiment of an unbreakable will. The swirling black clouds overhead formed a vast and threatening dome, while the distant horizon disappeared into the cold gray haze of smoke and war. His battle armor was covered in scratches, dirt, and the scars of countless brutal battles. The once pristine armor now appeared worn and battered. Yet that wear did not weaken him. His fists were clenched so tightly at his sides that veins stood out across his muscular arms. His entire body was rigid, as though containing a tremendous source of energy within. His face twisted with fierce determination, teeth clenched, and eyes blazing with relentless fighting spirit. It was not the expression of fear or despair, but the anger of a warrior who had witnessed too much loss and chosen to defy fate itself. Behind him, destroyed buildings loomed like giant ghosts of a collapsing civilization. Broken concrete, exposed steel frameworks, and debris-covered streets formed a grim post-war landscape. The entire city seemed to be holding its breath beneath the heavy sky before the true storm arrived. With thunderclouds churning behind him, the warrior was preparing to unleash every last ounce of his remaining power. "Another insect." Broly spoke. His upright green hair stood like the physical manifestation of primordial fury. Blood, dirt, and countless scars covered his face and massive body, while his glowing red eyes burned like living embers. Their crimson light cut through the battlefield's gray haze, radiating pure rage and an insatiable desire for destruction. Veins bulged across his forehead, his teeth clenched so hard that his face seemed distorted by fury. It was the brief silence before the next storm of destruction erupted, a moment when anger had surpassed every limit and transformed into an unstoppable force. Vegeta still stood firm beneath the storm-dark sky. Muscles tightened beneath his dirt-stained skin, highlighted by the cold light of the approaching tempest. His face was warped by rage and iron determination. Teeth clenched, eyes sharp as blades, he stared toward the distant horizon where destruction awaited. His fists tightened until his knuckles turned white, signaling the immense energy compressed within his body. It was the moment before the eruption, when pain, fury, and fighting spirit converged within a single man ready to challenge destiny amid the ruins of the apocalypse. "Enough. I'll deal with him myself," Vegeta said. Vegeta roared beneath the stormy heavens, as though every remaining ounce of power within his body was being forced outward. His black hair stood upright, whipped backward by violent winds, while his face was covered in dirt, dried blood, and deep cuts from the brutal battle he had just endured. The muscles along his neck protruded like steel cables, stretching toward a jaw clenched in pain and determination. The roar seemed powerful enough to pierce the screen itself. His mouth opened wide in a furious scream, his eyes shining with a will that refused to surrender. It was the cry of a warrior pushed to his absolute limit, where pain, loss, and pride had become one. Cold light pierced through the gaps in the clouds, creating harsh contrasts across his wounded face and making every feature appear sharper and more intense. It was the moment of unleashed power. Atop the ruined building, Vegeta stood firmly, fists clenched, his entire body taut like a volcano that had reached its final limit before eruption. A fierce roar erupted through the sky, shattering the oppressive silence hanging over the ruined city behind him. His face, covered in dust and wounds, twisted with the strain of unleashing the immense power surging within his body. Veins bulged along his neck and arms, revealing the terrifying pressure his body was enduring. Around him, a blazing golden aura erupted like a sea of fire. Streams of scorching energy spiraled around his body, hurling dust, rocks, and chunks of concrete into the air. Tiny sparks crackled through the atmosphere, making it seem as though the very air itself was being burned by the overwhelming power. Beneath his feet, the concrete ground fractured into deep cracks. A violent explosion of white gold light burst outward, illuminating the entire battlefield and casting a blinding radiance over the surrounding ruins. The power radiating from him was so immense that the entire structure seemed to tremble under an invisible force. A warrior pushed to his absolute limit had chosen to release every ounce of his strength, turning himself into the eye of an energy storm. Vegeta stood towering upon the shattered concrete like a god of the storm. Above him, the sky was swallowed by layers of swirling black clouds, heavy and ominous, casting the entire landscape into the cold gray tones of an apocalypse. A colossal explosion of energy erupted from his body. Blazing white gold light surrounded him like a newborn sun igniting within the heart of the devastated city. Violent waves of radiant fire swept outward in every direction, launching rubble, concrete, and twisted metal high into the air. Debris spun wildly within the expanding shockwave, forming a massive dust storm that seemed ready to consume everything around it. Vegeta tensed every muscle in his body, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. His mouth opened wide in a roar of pure fury, the sound seeming capable of piercing the dark clouds overhead. His muscles strained beneath the relentless pressure of power that continued to rise. Energy sparks burst through the air like a meteor shower, massive columns of dust twisted upward behind him, blending with the brilliant golden light. A warrior driven to the brink had unleashed the entirety of his will, transforming his rage into a flame capable of consuming the battlefield itself, a power great enough to change the outcome of a fight to the death. Time itself seemed frozen in a single explosive instant. In the foreground, Broly stood like a living wall of steel. Vegeta charged forward at a terrifying speed. His body tore through the air, creating violent white vortices around the fist. He drove straight toward his opponent. Long streaks of motion trailed behind him, giving the impression of a meteor plunging toward Earth. His face was rigid with fury, his eyes locked onto the only target before him. The pressure generated by his punch was so intense that the air warped into milky white waves. Dust, stone fragments, and debris were swept into the shockwave, spiraling into chaotic rings against the gloomy sky. Far behind them, the shattered remains of buildings stood like ghosts of a fallen civilization. One side was an unmoving engine of destruction, as cold and immovable as a mountain. The other was a warrior pouring every ounce of his will and strength into a decisive attack. The distance between the two opponents had shrunk to a mere fraction of a second. The two warriors hurled themselves at each other at speeds beyond human perception. Vegeta launched a direct assault. His arm extended like a steel spear, his fist tightly clenched and carrying the entirety of his power and fighting spirit. Muscles bulged beneath battle-scarred skin, reflecting absolute determination. His piercing eyes remained fixed on the target before him, leaving no room for hesitation or fear. The moment of impact froze in midair. Their faces were separated by only a few centimeters, each carrying enough power to destroy an entire city. The atmosphere itself seemed compressed by the crushing pressure of two opposing energies, creating the sense that a world-shaking explosion would tear apart the dark sky in the very next instant. For a brief moment amid the devastated battlefield, Vegeta's punch, carrying all of his strength, slammed directly into Broly's face. His white-gloved fist drove deep into Broly's cheek, distorting the giant warrior's features beneath the overwhelming force. The muscles along Vegeta's arm bulged like steel cables stretched to their limits. Every fiber trembled under the explosive force of an attack forged from unyielding fighting spirit. His eyes remained cold and completely focused, locked onto his target amid the chaos of war. Broly gritted his teeth, his scarred face twisted with pain and fury. Despite absorbing a blow powerful enough to crush steel and stone, he remained like an indomitable monster. Broly immediately unleashed a devastating counterpunch. His massive arm swelled with primal power. The strike carved a blur through the air, carrying the force of an impact capable of pulverizing steel and concrete. The blow connected cleanly. It drove straight into Vegeta's chest. Vegeta was blasted off course. His body blurred from speed, like a bullet fired backward across the battlefield. His muscles remained tense as dust and debris hung suspended in the air, while an invisible shockwave rippled through the heavy atmosphere. Amid the dust-filled sky, the armored warrior was hurled away like a meteor that had suddenly lost control. Broly remained frozen in the posture of his attack. His enormous arm still dragged silver-white distortions through the air, as though space itself had been torn apart by pure strength. Massive muscles rippled beneath scarred skin, reflecting the cold light of the storm-filled sky. Vegeta was sent flying at tremendous speed. His body hung helplessly in midair, his feet unable to find purchase. His battle armor vibrated from the force of the impact. Long trails of motion stretched behind him, creating the impression that he was smashing through an invisible wall of wind, thrown clear of the battlefield by a force far beyond ordinary limits. Vegeta's body slammed violently into the ground. A deafening explosion tore through the silence of the dying city. In the middle of the ruined avenue, the ground erupted as though a meteor had crashed down from the heavens, unleashing a colossal shockwave that swept everything aside. Thousands of fragments of concrete, twisted steel, and shattered stone were hurled into the air. Massive chunks of dark rock spun through a sea of dust, reflecting the fiery orange glow of the explosion raging within the impact zone. Tiny sparks scattered outward like a deadly meteor shower, piercing through the expanding wall of smoke. Above, layers of storm clouds twisted into violent formations, creating the impression that the end of the world had truly arrived. At the very center of the blast, stones shot outward while waves of black dust rose into towering walls of smoke, creating the suffocating sensation of power beyond control. This was a moment of energy unleashed to its absolute limit. The entire city trembled beneath the wave of destruction, while the atmosphere thickened with dust, fire, and echoing roars that sounded like the screams of a collapsing world. High among enormous storm clouds, Gohan streaked forward like a living spear, tearing through the atmosphere with nothing but willpower and raw strength. Every detail conveyed overwhelming speed and unwavering determination. His purple G had been torn apart by countless battles, exposing powerful muscles covered in sweat and battlefield dust. Every muscle across his arms, shoulders, and chest remained taut under the strain of traveling at extraordinary speed. Scratches and scars from combat were still visible across his skin. His face was lowered toward his destination, his eyes locked onto a distant target. There was no wild rage, only the absolute focus of a warrior who had surpassed his own limits. His black hair streamed backward in the rushing wind, forming sharp silhouettes like blades cutting through the sky. Around him, massive cloud formations churned beneath the cold light of an approaching storm. Thin layers of mist were ripped apart by the crushing pressure generated by his speed, leaving behind long trails of turbulence like the wake of a meteor descending toward Earth. It was the moment before the explosion. There was no scream, no detonation yet. Only the tense silence of a hero flying straight toward destiny beneath the dark sky of a world waiting for a collision powerful enough to shake the horizon itself. "Where is the legendary Saiyan warrior?" Broly asked. Broly's green hair stood upright and whipped through the wind, every sharp strand resembling a spear forged from primal power. Most terrifying of all were his glowing red eyes, burning like twin energy reactors. Their crimson light pierced the cold air and reflected across skin covered in scars and bulging veins, creating the impression of a caged fury trapped within his colossal body. His teeth were clenched so tightly that the muscles along his jaw bulged visibly. Every muscle in his neck stood out beneath the skin. The raging fire in his eyes alone was enough to make the atmosphere feel suffocating, like the final moment before a storm of annihilation swept across the world. Gohan plunged downward from an incredible height. His body pointed toward the earth like a living arrow, both arms pressed tightly against his sides as every muscle locked into an attack posture. His black hair was torn backward by the wind, while the red sash around his waist snapped violently in the rushing air. Behind him, a gigantic white shockwave stretched from the clouds all the way to the ground, forming a tunnel of air crushed by speeds far beyond human limits. The atmosphere trembled violently as raindrops and dust particles were swept into long blurred streaks, resembling a supersonic object piercing through the sky. Buildings rapidly expanded in his field of vision while the sky above darkened like a storm closing every possible escape. It was the instant before impact, when every ounce of the warrior's energy, determination, and fury had been compressed into a single descent capable of shaking an entire city. At the heart of a city crushed by war, a once busy avenue had become nothing more than a shattered strip of asphalt stretching toward the horizon, trapped between mountains of rubble, concrete, and collapsed steel frameworks. On either side stood charred buildings resembling the skeletons of gigantic beasts. Against a sky completely covered by swirling lead-colored storm clouds, Gohan hovered motionless in midair. His fists were clenched tightly at his sides, his body coated in dirt and dust. The red sash around his waist fluttered gently in the cold wind sweeping across the ruins below. From the ground beneath him, clouds of dust continued to rise, forming a gray veil across the battlefield and creating an overwhelming sense of pressure. A terrifying impact shattered the silence of the ruined city. In the middle of the devastated avenue littered with broken concrete and towering heaps of rubble, Gohan crashed from the sky at tremendous speed. His knees bent low, his body leaning forward as the entirety of his power slammed into the roadway like a meteor breaking through the atmosphere. The ground beneath him could not withstand the force. Asphalt shattered into branching cracks that spread in every direction while tons of dust, stone, and concrete were blasted into the air, forming two colossal walls rising on either side of his body. The shockwave swept across the battlefield like an invisible hurricane, dragging every fragment into a chaotic vortex. Far in the distance stood burned-out structures and buildings stripped down to their cold concrete skeletons. Above, black storm clouds churned violently while cold light reflected through the rising dust, creating an atmosphere of crushing tension and suffocation. At the center of the impact, gigantic columns of dust erupted symmetrically behind him like a pair of wings made of ash unfolding across the battlefield. "Tell me, big guy, are you enjoying this?" Gohan asked. Gohan's eyes stared straight ahead with absolute focus, as though the entire world around him had disappeared, leaving only the single target standing before him. Long scratches and layers of dirt covered his cheeks, forehead, and chin. Sweat glistened on his tan skin, reflecting the cold light cast by the stormy sky above. Every strand of black hair stood upright and whipped in the powerful wind, creating the impression that an invisible force was gradually awakening within his body. His lips parted slightly, his teeth clenched tightly. There was no panic or hesitation left, only the iron will of a warrior who had surpassed his own limits. The muscles of his face were drawn taut, every feature sharp as if carved from stone, conveying absolute determination in a life or death moment. Only rolling masses of black clouds and a gloomy light remained, blanketing the horizon like the final moment of silence before immense power erupted. A single gaze was enough to make the entire battlefield seem to hold its breath for a few brief seconds before the battle entered its next fiery chapter. In the heart of the ruined avenue, the pavement had shattered into countless deep cracks, like gigantic scars carved into the body of a dying city. The two warriors stood facing each other in a terrifying stillness before the next storm of violence. Gohan, with his black hair standing upright, possessed a lean, muscular frame clad in a tattered purple jai. Broly towered over him, his muscles bulging as if sculpted from stone, his wild green hair standing straight upward, his body covered in wounds whose blood had not yet dried. Around them, enormous slabs of concrete lay scattered like the remains of a civilization that had just collapsed. The buildings lining both sides of the avenue had been reduced to twisted concrete skeletons. Windows were shattered, and entire floors had been torn apart like paper by the destructive force that had swept through the area. Columns of gray smoke rose from the rubble, merging with the dust hanging in the air. Cold light pierced through the thick layers of black storm clouds overhead. The sky felt heavy, as though it were pressing down upon the earth itself. A constant tremor pulsed beneath their feet. The sound of cracking concrete mixed with the invisible currents of energy colliding between the two opponents. It was the moment when two colossal powers stood on opposite sides of the battlefield, creating an apocalyptic atmosphere and unbearable tension. The final seconds of silence, before a battle powerful enough to shake the entire city erupted. "You've made me angry once again," Broly said. His fury had reached its absolute peak. His glowing red eyes burned within the cold gray sky. The savage crimson light pierced through the murky air, making his gaze resemble the flames of a primordial creature awakened after being imprisoned in rage for far too long. His teeth ground together, and the muscles of his face tightened violently. Veins bulged beneath his taut skin, giving the impression that immense power was compressed inside his body, waiting for the perfect moment to explode. His upright green hair whipped wildly in the wind, forming razor-sharp silhouettes beneath the cold light of the stormy sky. Behind him, the heavens were choked with swirling layers of black clouds. There was no sunlight, only cold gray tones engulfing everything. Heavy breathing, the howl of the wind, and the grinding of teeth merged into a single expression of rage. His anger had surpassed every boundary of reason, transforming a warrior into the living embodiment of destructive power. His massive back, covered in countless scars, resembled a living wall of steel. Both fists were clenched at his sides, and his muscles rippled beneath dust-covered skin, signaling that a storm of power was about to erupt. Across from him, amid a road buried beneath broken bricks and shattered concrete, Gohan stood in a flawless fighting stance. His legs were lowered, his center of gravity rooted firmly into the cracked ground. His cold eyes remained locked on the opponent before him, unmoved by the overwhelming size difference. His gaze still carried an unbreakable will. From Broly's outstretched palm, a colossal sphere of green energy erupted. The blazing light burned like an artificial sun born amidst the ashes. Streams of lightning and spiraling waves of energy twisted around the glowing sphere, tearing through the dust-filled air and bathing the ruined landscape in a deadly green hue. Gohan stood at the epicenter of destruction. His entire body was engulfed in the dazzling green glow as he planted his feet firmly into the rubble-strewn ground to resist the overwhelming pressure rushing toward him. Chunks of concrete and twisted steel around him trembled violently, lifted from the ground by the force of the energy collision. The gigantic green energy sphere exploded within the ruined city like the birth of an artificial sun. Rings of brilliant light burst outward from the center in every direction, tearing apart the gray darkness and flooding the battlefield with an eerie green glow. Massive bolts of lightning twisted like thunder dragons writhing in fury, transforming the space into a chaotic storm of energy. Gohan braced himself against the overwhelming power. His feet dug into the shattered pavement, his body leaning forward in a desperate defensive posture. Both arms were raised before his chest, struggling to halt the tidal wave of destruction surging toward him like an unstoppable ocean of light. The explosion's brilliance was so intense that it swallowed every detail around it. The piles of broken concrete, the charred building frames, and the fractured streets became nothing more than vague silhouettes. The air itself seemed to tremble under the terrible pressure of the released energy, warping the ground and hurling dust and stone into violent spirals. Gohan appeared tiny before the enormous sphere of energy, every green ray reflected off his torn clothing and the cracked ground beneath him. He stood alone against a tsunami of energy capable of leveling an entire city, using every ounce of willpower and strength he had left to oppose a force that seemed beyond the limits of this world. The colossal green energy sphere churned with twisting streams of brilliant white electricity across its surface, like living veins of molten lava continuously erupting and spreading through its unstable shell. Its radiant green light painted the entire landscape in apocalyptic colors, turning the surrounding ruins into distorted shadows beneath the wrath of supernatural power. Gohan had pushed back the overwhelmingly large energy mass. His feet dug deeply into the shattered roadway, his body bent forward in a posture of ultimate resistance. Every muscle was stretched to its limit, as though it might tear apart beneath the crushing pressure pressing toward him, yet his unwavering stance radiated an indomitable will. The energy sphere exploded. A colossal pillar of blue-white light erupted in the center of the city, like a final judgment descending from the heavens. The brilliance was so overwhelming that it consumed every detail, transforming the world into a blazing sea of energy. The heart of the explosion shone like a star detonating upon the earth, unleashing power beyond anything humanity could imagine. From the point of impact, enormous clouds of dust were blasted skyward into towering walls of gray ash. The ground shook violently beneath the force of the explosion. Chunks of concrete, twisted steel, and shattered stone were hurled away like dry leaves in a storm. An invisible shockwave swept across the battlefield, crushing everything in its path with absolute power. Amid the blinding light, the ruined silhouettes of the buildings lining the avenue appeared only as faint ghosts. Charred concrete frames trembled beneath the terrifying pressure of the released energy. The atmosphere became thick with dust, smoke, and radiant energy. Pillars of debris rose like tsunamis of earth and stone, while the core of the explosion continued to swell and blaze brighter. It was the moment when two powers beyond all limits collided, creating an explosion powerful enough to shake the horizon itself, like the clash of mythical forces, where a single impact transformed an entire city into the epicenter of destruction. The ground after the explosion was covered with scorched fragments and layers of black ash. Remnants of the colossal blast still glowed with a faint orange-red light beneath the cold gray dust, surrounded by an atmosphere of death. Thin streams of white smoke curled upward from the rubble, twisting silently into the air, like the final breath of a battlefield that had been annihilated. Tiny particles of dust and ash floated through the atmosphere, catching the weak light reflected by the remaining embers. The background gradually disappeared into a haze of smoke and dust. After the fury of destructive power had passed, only a terrifying silence remained. The scorched earth resembled a gigantic scar carved into the ruined city, while smoldering columns of smoke rose as the final evidence of a battle far beyond human limits. A terrible force had swept through the area, leaving behind nothing but ashes, devastation, and the silence of a dying world. Amid a maze of shattered concrete and twisted steel in a city that had just endured catastrophe, a small living creature quietly appeared like the last remaining ray of light within a sea of ruins. A fluffy dog crouched within a narrow gap between broken slabs of concrete, its large brown eyes reflecting fear and confusion at a world that had completely changed. Dust and smoke still lingered in the cold gray air, weaving through rusted metal fragments and collapsed layers of brick and stone. Pale light pierced through the thick dust, illuminating the dog's fur, which was coated in ash and dirt. Every tangled strand and speck of dust clung to its youthful face. After all the destruction, only a suffocating silence remained. Its ears drooped, and its anxious eyes looked upward as though searching for something familiar amid the endless ruins, a master, an escape, or simply hope. Amid colossal battles, the most vulnerable are always the innocent lives left behind. The small dog huddled beneath a makeshift shelter formed by cracked concrete slabs and rusted steel beams. The space around it was dark, cold, and suffocating, as if the entire outside world had collapsed and only this fragile refuge remained. Its fluffy fur was tangled and covered in dust, while its front paws pressed lightly against the rubble, ready to retreat deeper into hiding if danger appeared. The storm-filled sky covered the ruins of the devastated city. Broly appeared as a being beyond human limits, hovering in the air like a god of war. Below him, ruined avenues stretched to the horizon, blanketed in dust and smoldering columns of smoke rising from collapsed buildings. Bare concrete frameworks stood precariously like the skeletons of a fallen civilization, while swirling black clouds overhead made it seem as though the sky itself was being distorted by an unseen force. Broly remained motionless in midair. His enormous body was covered in scars and the marks of countless battles. Every muscle stood out beneath the cold light of the storm. His fists were clenched at his sides, his feet suspended above the ground as if gravity itself had ceased to affect him. The sense of overwhelming dominance was absolute. That terrifying stillness only intensified the tension beneath the darkened sky. Columns of dust spiraled upward from the ground, and tiny fragments of debris were swept away by invisible currents, revealing the terrifying energy radiating from his body. It was a moment when nature, the city, and even the world itself seemed insignificant before a power capable of changing the fate of everything around it. "Is that all you've got?" Broly said. His upright green hair whipped through the storm like blades. His face was covered in scars and deep marks left by countless battles, while his narrowed eyes burned with primal fury. His clenched teeth gave the impression that he was struggling to contain a power beyond even his own limits. Cold light from the gloomy sky swept across his massive frame, highlighting muscles that looked as though they had been carved from granite. Veins bulged across his chest, shoulders, and arms, suggesting immense power, surging beneath his battle-scarred skin. Broly threw back his head and laughed loudly in a fit of primal rage. The sound seemed powerful enough to shake the dying ruins of the buildings behind him. His enormous physique became utterly overwhelming. Every massive muscle looked hewn from solid stone, covered with long scars and twisting veins resembling cracks left behind by an earthquake. Cold light from the stormy sky swept across his rugged skin, emphasizing the terrifying power filling every fiber of his being. His upright green hair whipped wildly in the raging wind, resembling flames burning upward against the gloomy heavens. His face twisted in absolute fury. His white teeth clenched before opening into a thunderous roar. His throat tightened, and the muscles of his face contorted as colossal energy surged upward from deep within. Behind him, the city had become nothing more than the skeletal remains of shattered concrete beneath a pitch-black sky. The clouds swirled violently overhead, as if responding to his fury. As his rage reached its peak, what would come next would no longer be a battle, it would be a catastrophe. Only a heavy silence remained, hanging over every fragment of broken concrete. Amid the scattered rubble, Gohan lay motionless on the cracked ground. His purple G had been torn into strips, covered in dirt and scorch marks from the battle that had just taken place. His battered body lay among massive slabs of concrete like a warrior who had exhausted every last ounce of strength in a confrontation beyond human limits. Jagged cracks spread across the pavement. Twisted steel bars protruded from the ruins like shattered bones of a city crushed by unimaginable power. Pale sunlight filtered through the dust hanging in the air, casting a cold gray-yellow tone over the scene. Only the sound of wind passing through the ruins remained, accompanied by dust particles silently drifting to the ground. Gohan lay face down on the rubble, one hand still gripping the ground as if, in his final moment of strength, he had tried to rise and continue fighting. His messy black hair obscured his face. His hand clutched the fractured concrete. Fingers covered in dirt and wounds twitched slightly, like the final reflex of a will determined to survive. Veins stood out along his scarred arm. His shoulders were covered in injuries, and bruised skin showed beneath the pale light of the fading afternoon. His once sharp, upright black hair was now disheveled and coated in dust, no longer carrying the appearance of a warrior at the peak of his strength, but of someone who had just emerged from hell. Gohan's face rested against the cold ground. His eyes were shut tightly, his brows still furrowed in pain, as though even after exhausting all his strength, the fighting spirit within him had not completely surrendered. Every breath became heavy amid the devastation, creating a suffocating sense of fragility. In a moment that seemed to mark complete exhaustion, Gohan began to move. His fingers tightened around the cracked earth, and the muscles in his arms tensed beneath skin covered with scrapes and cuts. He poured every remaining ounce of willpower into each labored breath, every slow but determined movement. As he pushed himself upward, small stones rolled down from the surrounding debris, as if the very ground were witnessing the struggle between collapse and perseverance. Blood, dust, and sweat mixed across his lowered face, yet determination remained visible in every feature. His hands gripped the rubble tightly as his body slowly rose from the wreckage, while the background blurred into collapsed buildings and drifting clouds of dust. His right hand clenched a cracked slab of concrete for support while one knee dug deep into the dust and gravel. Every muscle in his arm bulged under tremendous strain as he tried to lift himself from the ground. Each movement felt unbearably heavy, as though the entire weight of failure rested upon his shoulders. After struggling to support his battered body and stand, Gohan collapsed once more onto the slope of a massive concrete block. One arm hung limply at his side, his fingers curling slightly in the body's final response to pain. His chest rose and fell weakly beneath his torn clothing, showing that he was still alive, but only barely holding onto consciousness. Gohan's face turned toward the sky, his eyes half open with exhaustion. There were no more roars of power, no blazing energy surges, no attacks powerful enough to shake the earth. Only the heavy silence that follows a battle remained, where every breath became a battle of its own. Yet he still carried the weight of hope, as if one final spark of determination would be enough for that warrior to rise again and continue fighting for what remained of this world. "You will pay for this," Goku's voice echoed. Amid the ruins of a city crushed by war, surrounded by a sea of collapsed concrete and twisted steel beams, dark storm clouds churned overhead, heavy with the promise of an apocalyptic storm. Cold light pierced through the gray cloud cover, casting a grim and ominous tone over the landscape. Goku suddenly appeared as if he had teleported. His familiar orange gi was stained with dirt and burn marks. Scratches lined his arms and face, yet his eyes remained sharp and completely focused. There was no panic, no fear, only the calm of a man who had long grown accustomed to facing disasters far beyond humanity's limits. Around him, the wind howled through shattered concrete structures, carrying ashen fragments that floated through the air. The atmosphere was filled with tension before a critical turning point. The buildings had become little more than broken concrete skeletons. The streets had transformed into a wasteland battlefield, stretching to the horizon. Yet amid all that destruction, the warrior's stance remained firm, like the final beacon of hope. A warrior preparing to make a decisive move, carrying the fragile belief that even in the darkest moment, there was still a chance to change the fate of the world. "It took far too long for the real party to begin," Broly said. His glowing red eyes burned intensely within a face covered in scars and bulging veins. Crimson light from his pupils reflected across wrinkles and old wounds, making it seem as though a destructive force was blazing deep within him. His green hair stood upright, and flowed slightly within an invisible current surrounding his rage-filled face. His teeth were clenched, facial muscles taut, and lowered brows turned his gaze into a cold blade, as though every final restraint of reason had vanished. Only pure battle instinct and explosive fury remained. "Subscribe to the channel to see what happens next," Goku said. He clenched both fists so tightly that veins bulged along his battered arms. His muscles tightened like steel cables, his chest heaving after the prolonged battle. His face twisted as a fierce roar erupted from deep within him, his eyes burning with unyielding determination. It was not the cry of despair, it was a challenge to fate itself, a final act of defiance against a power that seemed impossible to defeat. Cold winds swept dust and shattered stone around his feet. Bent pieces of metal trembled among the ruins as if reacting to the energy rising within him. The hero had been pushed to his absolute limit, yet instead of falling, he chose to stand once more. A moment where a warrior's will confronted the destruction of an entire world, and a single roar beneath the stormy sky was enough to reveal the awakening power within. Goku's fists tightened to their absolute limit. Then, in an instant, a thunderous roar tore through the heavy atmosphere, accompanied by the eruption of an immense power from deep within his body. A colossal pillar of golden-orange light shot into the sky like a volcano awakening from slumber. The blazing radiance consumed everything, transforming the black storm clouds above into a dazzling sea of fire. Millions of tiny energy sparks exploded in every direction like a meteor shower, creating a spectacle that was both magnificent and terrifying. Around Goku, the earth shook violently. Massive boulders and giant slabs of concrete were lifted from the ground by the overwhelming pressure of his energy, floating in midair as though gravity itself had vanished. Debris spiraled wildly within the shockwave, streaking through clouds of dust in blazing light. At the center of that storm of power, Goku threw back his head and roared, his eyes shut tightly as he pushed beyond every remaining limit. Veins bulged along his neck and arms, while his torn orange gi whipped violently beneath the pressure of the erupting energy. Golden light from the aura reflected across every muscle, making his body appear forged from molten metal. Goku stood at the center of a colossal energy explosion. Behind him stretched the storm-filled sky, before him lay the shattered remains of the ruined city. The power that had been sealed away for so long was finally unleashed, violent, overwhelming, and overflowing with energy to such an extent that the very screen seemed to tremble with every wave of power radiating from the warrior. His black hair had transformed into a brilliant golden color, standing upright like glowing blades amid a sea of energy flames. His eyes shone with extraordinary power while his face remained tense within the echo of his mighty roar. Every muscle across his neck, shoulders, and arms bulged beneath the radiant light, revealing a tremendous power surging far beyond ordinary limits. His orange gi rippled within the violent currents surrounding him. Beneath his feet, the ground split apart, and dust and debris were continuously blasted away by the immense pressure of his energy. The ruins on either side of the scene appeared to be pushed back from the center of the explosion, creating the impression that even space itself trembled before this awakening. The sky above was dyed gold by the light radiating from Goku's body. The black clouds twisted and split apart beneath the colossal energy column, making the entire spectacle resemble a natural phenomenon beyond all known laws. It was the moment a warrior surpassed his final limit. Amid a world consumed by ruin and despair, he stood like a lighthouse of fire, a source of power blazing with triumph, awakening, and absolute might, like the climactic scene of a blockbuster where a true legend is born.